Okay, I think we're ready to get started. Again, welcome to this week's office hours for ESG and ESGCV. My name is LaQuantia Goodman, and I am today's moderator. If you're just joining us, please go to the chat and introduce yourself with your name and the region you represent. As a reminder, this office hours session is being recorded for public record. Office hours recordings are on the California ESG CV past trainings webpage. A copy of the slide deck and recording will also be emailed to you. Next slide. How to ask a question. All questions must be submitted in the chat box. Please type your organization and question into the chat box. The team will read questions out loud at the end of the presentation and will provide answers, if possible, throughout the presentation. All questions and answers entered in the chat box will be recorded as part of the public record. Alongside our presenters, we also have several HCD staff, including ESG representatives, ESG CV grant administrators, and other consultants who are able to answer questions during the question and answer session. Next slide. Today's office hours session agenda includes the following: ESG and ESG CV updates, office hours updates, upcoming trainings, ESG and ESG CV question and answer, and our spotlight series for today, DLB and supplantation, fraud and risk management. Next slide. We'll now have our ESG updates by Anthony.
Thank you, LaQuantia. No updates from the ESG side today, but I did have a few slides just as reminders here in terms of the contract years. The 2021 contracts expenditure deadline is approaching in August of this year. Something to keep in mind if you haven't already been made aware of that. The 2022 ESG award announcements, those contracts have begun routing. So that's good news, and you should be hearing from us soon on those. The 2023 ESG annual NOFA will be released in just a couple weeks after the 4th, probably the week after the 4th. That's what we're shooting for, most likely around mid-month in July. Next slide, please. And you've seen these slides, next two slides before. Just want to keep them here for reference for you. As always, there's the ESG NOFA resources page, a lot of policy documents there in terms of how to, they can answer a lot of your questions. Next slide, please. And if you don't find what you're looking for there, or if you're confused on something, please reach out to your representative. They're right there on the slide, and you can always email the ESG NOFA inbox. Thank you, LaQuantia. That's all I have.
Thank you, Anthony. And now for our ESG CV updates. Reminders for performance milestones. All program funds for projects, which include street outreach, emergency shelter, rapid rehousing, and homelessness prevention, all must be expended by September 30th, 2023. All funds for HMIS and administrative costs shall be expended by October 31st, 2023. And all final RFFs must be submitted no later than November 15th, 2023. Next slide. Reminders while planning for ESG CV closeout. Spend down timing. Know when you're approaching the end. Know that most funds are due to be spent by September 30th, so don't spend too fast, but time it just right. Funding continuity. Consider HAP funding and other funding streams that will allow you to continue to serve clients after closeout. Closing intake. Projected dates for closing client intake for rental assistance. Set dates and deadlines to stop accepting clients in client intake and prepare for final rapid rehousing assistance. Staffing issues. Estimate declining caseloads for staff roles and workload. Just like we need to make sure we are not leaving participants with nowhere to go, we also need to make sure we are thinking of ways to keep our staff employed. Client issues, involving and informing participants well before the end of assistance. Make sure you involve and inform participants timely before assistance ends so they can prepare as well. No clients should become homeless because a program is closing. Next slide. Office hours updates. Next week, we have procurement and best practices. And on July 5th, due to the 4th of July holiday, there will be no office hours. Next slide. This slide contains our new HCD office hours trainings access. First link is training site to register for office hours series if you haven't already done that, or if something happens and you need to re-register. And then the second link is for our, so that you're able to view our past trainings. Kim has dropped those links in the chat, but remember that they will also be in the slide deck. Next slide. Upcoming trainings. June 22nd, the HMIS Data Quality Management Program 2 Community Workshop. This session will focus on the data quality aspects of timeliness and consistency and talk through the components through the lens of a comprehensive DQMP. Next slide. Do you have any questions at this time? Not seeing any in the chat right now. Next slide. If you have further questions, please contact your annual ESG rep as previously explained, using or contacting that rep directly or using esgnofa@hcd.ca.gov email address. Or for ESGCV, please reach out to your grant administrator. Next slide. And now I will turn it over to Chris Andrews for our spotlight presentation.
Great, thank you so much. Good morning, everyone. We are here today. We're going to talk a little bit about fraud, waste, and abuse, and duplication of benefits. As we're talking about closeout at the top of the office hours, I think making sure all of the documentation you can have on DOB as you're doing monitoring, as you're evaluating your programs, and doing your double checks from a fraud, waste, and abuse perspective is always very helpful. So if we can go ahead to the next slide. Want to begin by just highlighting all of the legislation, kind of in all of the acts and the CFRs that go into fraud, waste, and abuse and duplication of benefits, beginning with ESG program regs, Part 576, but also throughout to CFR 200. And then when we're talking about DOB, specifically references for it in the CARES Act, in the Stafford Act, and then the Disaster Recovery Reform Act. So if you do have questions on what we're talking about here, if you want to go back to the source information, these are the primary sources of legislation. Next slide. So to begin, we're going to start talking about fraud, waste, and abuse. It's something in all of your programs, in your guidelines, in HCD guidelines and policies. There are systems to prevent, and to detect and to avoid fraud, waste, and abuse. But want to just take a couple minutes here and just review what is fraud, waste, and abuse, and then what are some quick ways that you can think about for preventing it. Next slide. So first, we'll talk about fraud. Fraud is, the deception or the wrongful doing to gain personal or financial gain within the program. This can be done through fraudulent statements, concealing information in a bid, making false statements, whatever it may be, but with the intent of wrongful or criminal deception. Waste and mismanagement is a bit broader of a category. So looking at any action, that is primarily careless or mishandling or, intentionally or unintentionally abusing resources that can cause or potentially could cause detriment to the program. This can be done by not observing rules, requirements, laws, policies when handling ESG and ESG CV funds that lead to poor use, incorrect use, or wrongful use of those funding sources. And then finally, what is abuse? Abuse being excessive or improper use, of the funding of a piece of the program, kind of contrary to the requirements. The abuse can occur both from a financial perspective, right, in terms of the money itself. It can also occur from a non-financial, in terms of program operation and how that operation is being carried out. Next slide. So those are kind of pretty broad definitions. I think for me, it's really helpful to think about fraud, waste, and abuse in looking at what are examples, or what are different criteria that would equal fraud, that would equal waste, that would equal abuse. Fraud, falsifying information to applications, having a contractor or a subrecipient who is billing for services that aren't rendered, or a duplication of payments, altering documents, including proposals, applications, contracts, invoices, bribery or kickbacks, and then kind of more boldly, right, theft or embezzling funds from a program. And then examples of waste and mismanagement. It could be incurring unnecessary costs from poor management, poor systems, poor controls, right? If you're purchasing unnecessary equipment, maybe you needed one computer for a job, but you ended up purchasing 10 computers. Purchasing supplies without regard to cost, right? Not evaluating what is the appropriate cost, what is a reasonable cost, what is a necessary cost for a supply or for equipment or for a good. And then using those supplies carelessly, right? Not taking care of that investment that's being made into the program. And then finally, examples of abuse. Examples of abuse can be making procurement selections that don't align with the program policies and procedures. Using one's position, right, for gain, or for gain for someone else, right? If you are part of a funding committee, and you're using that funding committee position, for personal gain or gain for another. Creating unneeded overtime, requesting staff, requesting providers, requesting contractors to perform personal errands, or to be doing work that isn't an ESG activity or is not an ESG CV activity, but asking for that work to be done under that vehicle. Those would all be examples of abuse. Next slide. So how do you prevent, right? I think this is something that I want to be clear, we don't see a lot of, in ESG and ESG CV programs. And I think I generally believe that we are all here, with the intent to do the right thing. But I think it is very important to make sure you have systems in place to prevent fraud, waste, and abuse. And we think of it kind of in three different categories, right? Awareness, making sure everyone is aware of what can constitute fraud, what can constitute waste, what can constitute abuse. Prevention, what are the methods that you are actively taking to ensure that fraud, waste, or abuse is not occurring? And then finally, detection. If it does occur, how are you confirming, validating, checking to see that it did occur, and then so that you can take appropriate action to mitigate or correct that fraud, waste, or abuse that occurred. From awareness, it begins with things like this, right? Being able to have trainings, having resource materials that summarize what constitute fraud, waste, or abuse. having clauses in contracts or subcontracts or grant agreements or subrecipient agreements that articulate, what constitutes fraud, waste, and abuse, and making sure that everybody understands what is allowable and is not allowable under a federal award. Prevention, again, begins with training, making sure that people are aware of what they can and cannot do, having policies and procedures that very clearly articulate what can and cannot be done, what is allowable, and how certain things are done, be it around procurement, be it around purchasing supplies, and so on, making sure that there are systems in place to avoid the possibility of fraud, waste, or abuse occurring. And with that, segregation of duties ties into that, right? If we rest all authority or responsibility in a single individual, it becomes much easier for that individual intentionally or unintentionally to commit fraud, waste, or abuse. By segregating duties, you have multiple people who are responsible within that workflow, and it becomes easier to ensure that fraud, waste, or abuse will not occur. Conducting monitoring and audits, right? HCD is now going through the process of monitoring all of the ESG-CV grantees. ESG-CV grantees are in the process of monitoring their own subrecipients and evaluating their own programs or doing a self-monitoring. And that is a very helpful way as you're looking at both the financial and the non-financial kind of programmatic components of the ESG, CV, ESG programs to ensure that fraud, waste, or abuse is not occurring. And then finally, including specific provisions in subrecipient agreements, in contracts, in subcontracts that articulate what is fraud, waste, and abuse, and the repercussions if it is to occur. And then finally, detection, right? Having mechanisms in place that a subrecipient could report fraud, waste, or abuse to an ESG grantee, to the COC. Having those policies and procedures still in place, right? That provide a mechanism for how it could be detected, how that reporting could be done, if it's through an email hotline, a telephone hotline, a paper mail hotline, whatever it is, but having those opportunities for detection, again, through monitoring and audits. In that monitoring and audit, you should be able to flag or identify anything that is coming out as being atypical or not ordinary, and potentially having a component of fraud, waste, or abuse in it. And then again, in any contract or subcontract or subrecipient grant agreement. Before we jump to duplication of benefits, I just wanted to pause. Chris, is there anything that you wanted to make sure to add on fraud, waste, or abuse? Hearing none. And then if you all do have questions, kind of been thinking about both what constitutes fraud, waste, or abuse, or questions on how to prevent or detect or how to incorporate into your program, please put them into the chat. We're going to do a quick run through of duplication of benefits, and then should have plenty of time to answer your questions. Next slide. We've talked about DOB in a couple of different training environments, but I think it's an odd topic, so I think it's always really helpful to level set what is DOB. And so duplication of benefits, or DOB, occurs when a person, an individual, a family, a household, a business, a government, nonprofit, any other entity receives financial assistance from multiple sources for the same purpose. And that total assistance received is more than the total need for assistance, right? So that the important things there are receiving assistance from multiple sources for the same use, right? So if you're getting money for one thing from nonprofit A and getting money for another thing from nonprofit B, because you're not using it for the same purpose, right, you're not in a position where you're needing to think about duplication of benefits. And then a duplication of benefits only occurs when the total assistance received is more than the total need for assistance. So when the total funding is more than the need for assistance is when you can see a DOB occurring. Next slide. So DOB requirements are applicable to anyone receiving ESG CV funding, right? So all California HCD and all of its subrecipients at this point have adopted and are now following or should be following policies and procedures to ensure that a duplication of benefits does not occur both at the activity level, right? So if you're funding street outreach at that entire street outreach level, and also at the beneficiary level. And we'll talk about when it is applicable at an activity or at the beneficiary or client level. And so this is an applicable requirement, and you need to make sure you're following your policies and procedures for any CARES Act funding, as well as any ESG formula funding that is being used to prevent, prepare for, or respond to COVID-19. Next slide. And so we all play a role in thinking about DOB, right? So at the grantee level, the state is responsible that DOB is not incurring for any of the ESG CV funds and has overall responsibility and oversight. All of the COCs, all the subrecipients, are responsible for developing and adopting DOB policies and procedures, and then ensuring that those apply to all programs. And then providers, they're responsible for operating under the requirements set forth by their subrecipient. And that's really important to note, right? You may have a subrecipient that has a certain DOB policy that may differ, maybe a little bit more stringent, or have different wording than what is standardized under California HCD, or what have been some of the templates that have come out of HUD. And it's important for that provider to make sure they're operating under the requirements set forth by their subrecipient. Next slide. So at the subrecipient level, the subrecipient is responsible for monitoring and ensuring that all service providers are applying and following their DOB policies and procedures correctly. And then reporting any DOB, any occurrence of DOB to HCD. So, right, so if DOB is occurring, if you found that DOB occurred and you need to reconcile, making sure that's being reported and documented to HCD. And I think really, when we talk about DOB, for those who have talked about it in the past, I think I say just document over and over and over again. It becomes really, really important that you are maintaining as much documentation as you can to show that a DOB is not occurring. Next slide. So depending on the activity that you're engaging in, right, you might be having to do a DOB analysis at the activity level or at the beneficiary or program participant level. So for all activity types, right, whether it be shelter or temporary shelter outreach, rapid rehousing or homeless prevention, and even within HMIS and admin, need to document that DOB is not occurring at that activity level. And then whenever rental assistance is being provided, documenting in that rapid rehousing or homeless prevention program that that program participant is not receiving a duplication of benefits. It's really important to pause here that this is, aside from adding in the terminology DOB, no different than what you're doing with your ESG or continuum of care programs kind of day in and day out, right? You're making sure that you're not duplicating funds. You're making sure that a program participant's not receiving rental assistance from multiple entities or other assistance that might be, double charged, right? That would, also line in with our example of what could be fraud or abuse or waste. And here we're just adding a layer kind of documentation and under the DOB terminology. But for all intents and purposes, this is no different than what you've been doing for as long as you've been operating your program. With that being said, we can go ahead to the next slide, sorry. The process of a DOB analysis should follow 4 basic steps, right? So 1, kind of determining the amount of need. What is the need for the street outreach program? What is the need for the shelter? What is the need for rental assistance for that individual receiving homeless prevention or rapid rehousing? And then number 2, kind of verifying awards and use, right? Determine any assistance that's coming from any other source and how much is coming in and what the intent of that funding is, right? So if a shelter is receiving ESG-CV funding through the state, ESG-CV funding from the entitlement in its jurisdiction, and then from another state or local funding source, kind of verifying each of those awards and determining what is the use of those awards. And then 3, you're calculating your unmet need. So you're essentially subtracting the verify award in a step 2 from step 1. So you've got your total award amount and you're subtracting kind of all of the other awards that are being made, all the other assistance that's going to that use or going to address that need. And that is the maximum ESG CV award or the unmet need. And then 4, again, document, right? Documenting the other awards, documenting how the need was assessed, and then documenting the calculation that was made and saving all of that in the program file. Next slide. So thinking about that from an activity level perspective, right? You're determining the total amount of need for that activity. You're then determining all of the assistance that is going to the activity. You're calculating your maximum level of award, and then you're documenting that duplication of benefit analysis. Again, I think these are things that we all have done and will continue to do after ESG-CV, but I don't think we necessarily would document them in this fashion. Next slide. So let's look at an example from a shelter. So step 1, right, we're going to assess the needs. Monthly operating costs, let's say $10,000 a month. We're looking at operating the shelter for a year. $120,000. Essential service costs that are being borne by the shelter are $6,000 a month or an additional $72,000, right? So we're looking at a total need of $192,000. And then determining other assistance. In the application, that provider reported that they would be receiving $40,000 from a local foundation for case management services and other essential service costs, right? So then we move on to step 3, which is calculating what is the maximum ESG CV award. So we have our total need of $192,000, other assistance equals $40,000, leaving a total award of $152,000. And then again, document. So you're documenting how the estimate of the monthly operating costs, the essential service costs were made, documenting that $40,000 coming from the local foundation, and keeping all of that in the activity file. Next slide. So now looking at the program participant or the beneficiary in a level analysis, and this is only applicable when we're looking at financial assistance for housing relocation or stabilization services, anything under 576-105A. Determine the total amount of need for each ESG CV funded cost type. And again, so it's important to think that you're only needing to do that DOB calculation, that unmet need calculation, when you're looking at multiple, when you're looking at the same funding going into the same cost type, or different funding going into the same cost type. If they're going to different cost types, so if something's funding moving and something's funding security deposits and something else is funding rental assistance, those would be three different cost types. And then again, determine your assistance, calculate the maximum ESG CV award, and document. So next slide. So within HCD's policies, they require that DOB analysis at the individual level whenever direct financial assistance is being applied, right? What we just touched on, you're certifying that DOB does not occur, often through intake or application process. And then I think it's always very important that the landlord or the property manager is understanding the DOB requirements and the repayment provisions of that agreement, right? If the landlord or the property manager is being paid twice, they need to understand the repayment provisions under an ESG or ESG CV lease agreement, and that they would have to owe that money back to the program. So let's look at an example. Next slide. So here we're looking at an example of rental assistance. Monthly rent is $2,500 over a 1-year period. It is a cost of $30,000. And that is the need. The applicant reported that they received $1,000 from a local organization for security deposit assistance, but not for their monthly rent, which is the use of ESG CV. So as we calculate the maximum level award, the total need is $30,000. Other assistance is zero, right? We're only evaluating for what the ESG CV cost type is, which in this case is rental assistance. So the total level of award can be that full $30,000, the monthly rent for the 12-month period. And then again, documenting. And with that, I think we can pause for questions.
We don't see any in the chat right now, but if you do have questions, please raise your hand or just come off mute and ask your questions. Here's one from Miriam. What are some training best practices to prevent fraud, waste, mismanagement, and abuse?
So I think oftentimes where I've encountered fraud or waste or abuse, it is often unintentional. And so I think one, kind of within a training, making sure that the folks are aware of what constitutes fraud, what constitutes waste, what constitutes abuse, and then providing a lot of examples. I think fraud, waste, and abuse is a really good topic area to do an example-based training. I think you can walk through and do different scenarios of, would this constitute fraud? Would this constitute waste? Would this constitute abuse? And can really fill a training by going through what are different examples and what would constitute, and then what would you do? How would you react? How would you respond? How would you take care of it?
Thanks, Chris. LaQuante, I'll just make a statement here. Might not actually be a question, but we are really focused on fraud, waste, abuse, supplantation, as California ESG themselves are being monitored by HUD's Inspector General, and that's what they are focusing on. So we want to make sure that folks at the CSC level, at the ESG recipient and subrecipient levels, and some subrecipient levels, sorry, I got too many levels there, are all aware of this and taking it into account. So hopefully you can take that today. As far as if we have done activities already and haven't done duplication of benefit, Chris, what is our guidance there for folks?
Yeah, absolutely. Right. The DOB guidance from HUD didn't come out until halfway through the program. And so I think there were a lot of activities that were stood up without a strict DOB policy or procedure, or maybe a DOB policy or procedure that evolved or changed quite a bit. I think one, right, I mentioned a couple of times, the concept of DOB is something that you've been doing in your program throughout, right? You were doing it before ESG-CV, you're going to do it after ESG-CV. You had policies to ensure reasonable and necessary costs. And so being able to document that and show that is helpful. You don't necessarily need to go back retroactively to a program participant who received rapid rehousing in late 2020 or early 21 and try to do that DOB calculation and say, okay, can you certify that you didn't receive any other funding, right? I think at that point it would say, or I would say, in our regular program policy, we evaluated to make sure that the funding was necessary. In that, we looked at questionnaires around, are you receiving other funding? Do you have other needs? How are those other needs being met? And that determined what was that type of assistance. At an activity level, I think about it a little bit differently. I would look and say, okay, well, what other funding did you receive for the shelter program or the street outreach program? And that's something that's a bit easier to go back and retroactively document. You're not going back to every client who you serve, but you're just looking at the overall outreach program or the overall shelter program and documenting that, yes, you indeed had a need, and being able to include that documentation in the file.
Thank you, Chris. And thank you, Chris Pitcher, for that insight. I don't see any more questions in the chat one last time. Does anyone want to come off mute or raise your hand to ask a question? I don't want to hold you if there aren't any questions. Well, we're not seeing any more.
I just want to reiterate, right, that I think when in monitoring, we so often see kind of a lack in a DOB section of a program file. And because people say, well, there wasn't any DOB, so we didn't document it. And I want everyone to keep in mind, you're not documenting it just for right now in this moment. that DOB doesn't exist, you're also documenting it if in 3 years or 4 years, someone's looking at your file, you want to be able to go back and point and say, well, no, there wasn't DOB. Look, we documented that DOB didn't exist because there wasn't other funding going into the activity, or the need of that shelter was so great that our funding didn't exceed the total need by any means, or the need of that outreach program was so great. So being able to document that, you're not both for now, but you're also documenting it for the future.
Thank you for making that point, Chris. I do think oftentimes we don't, we don't document that, at least to say that, we've reviewed the file or we've met with this client and there is no duplication of benefits. But definitely, thinking about future reviews of the file, people looking back to make sure that there was no duplication of benefits, making sure that we documented in the file at the time that we, have that contact with the file is very important. So thank you for that. Well, we're not seeing any other questions. So we would like to thank you all for the questions that we did have, and thank you all for being here in attendance today. And thank you for your presentation, Chris. Remember, everyone, as you exit this session, there will be a short survey, so please take a minute to answer it for us. We look forward to reviewing what you've entered in the survey so that we can better assist you with training and technical assistance needs. Thank you again for being here today, and we'll see you next week. Have a great day.